Okay, in this narrative, we are going to take a look at the genealogy of Jesus, the narrative of chapters 1 to 7, and then the fulfillment quotations. And what this is going to do is going to help us to better understand who Matthew is writing for and the issues that he is wrestling with as he writes. So we'll start with the genealogy, and it's going to sound like a bunch of names to you, but I'm going to go ahead and read it. And I want you to pay attention to listen for exceptions. Okay, so there'll be a basic pattern, but at times the pattern is going to be interrupted. And so I want you to listen for the interruptions in the pattern, and then we'll talk about those. So Matthew chapter 1, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. And Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram, and Ram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, and Solomon the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asaph, and Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, and Joram the father of Uzziah, and Uzziah the father of Jotham, and Jotham the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, and Manasseh the father of Amos, and Amos the father of Josiah, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. And after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, and Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel the father of Abiud, and Abiud the father of Eliakim, and Eliakim the father of Azor, and Azor the father of Zadok, and Zadok the father of Achim, and Achim the father of Eliud, and Eliud the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Mathan, and Mathan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ, 14 generations. Okay, so there's a few things there that I'm sure that you picked up on in terms of breaks in the pattern. And so the first thing that we noticed is this kind of division of everything in terms of we have 14, 14, 14. So 14 generations of Abraham to David. So Abraham to David, 14 generations, and then we have from David to I should put it this way, to the exile, because that's what gets highlighted, 14 generations. So from David to the exile, we have 14 generations, and then from the exile to Jesus, 14 more generations. Now, this setting up in terms of 14s, that's kind of the work of Matthew. That some of these generations have been telescoped, and so Matthew makes it, 14, 14, 14 as he reports the generations. Okay, so why does he do this? Well, here you have Abraham to David, kind of this rise, if you will. So David is at the pinnacle. We'll start with Abraham and the promise to Abraham, and then we have this kind of rising action to King David. And so we have the promise to Abraham, to you and through your offspring, I'm going to give you children and land, and through your offspring, I'm going to bless all peoples. Okay, and then we have this crescendo to David, where we get another big promise that I will make your son king, and he will be a son to me, and I'll be a father to him, and you will have an everlasting dynasty. So we have this rise to David. And then we have this fall. From this promise of a dynasty to now they are in exile. And so the fall is complete. They had 14 generations of rising. Now we got 14 generations of fall, all the way to exile. And it looks like the promises are broken. But God doesn't break promises. And so now we have this movement from the exile to Jesus, who is the fulfillment of these promises. You'll notice how Matthew starts, that Jesus is the son of Abraham, that Jesus is the son of David. What Matthew is saying is that Jesus is the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham, of the promise to David. And so we have this kind of balancing of history so that Jesus is kind of at the fullness of history, that history is being made complete by the birth of Jesus, by the coming of Jesus, and by his reign. Okay, so I'm sure you picked up on that, the 14, the 14, the 14, kind of the rise, the fall, and then the rise again, the fulfillment, and especially the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham and to David. Now, one thing you need to know about genealogies, and I don't know if you are aware of this or not, you might be, but the whole purpose of a genealogy is to legitimate status. Okay, let me go ahead and write that. So, legitimate, hopefully I spelled it right, status. Okay, so in the ancient world, it was important to be able to verify your status, especially in a patriarchal society, because that validated your claim to land. And so if you didn't have any, if you didn't have a genealogy to kind of prove that you belonged to the family, that you had a share in the inheritance, then you could be left out. Okay, and so genealogies were important to legitimate your status, both in terms of claims to inheritance or land, and then also in terms of, being able to lay claim to a position in society. So maybe you were a priest, maybe you were a Levite, maybe you were serving some level of nobility within the kingdom. Okay, so those who kept track of their genealogy, so to speak, were those who had status and had a claim to make upon a family inheritance or upon the status of a family. And so one of the things that Matthew is doing through this genealogy is he is legitimating the status of Jesus. That Jesus really is the royal Messiah, that Jesus is of the line of David as well as Abraham. And so the genealogy is saying something about Jesus, something about his status, his ability to lay claim to the throne of David, that he's in the line of David. And so he can lay claim to the throne. Okay, so that's one part of it. And again, I can't emphasize it enough, that right off the bat, Matthew is arguing that Jesus is the fulfillment of the promises to Abraham and to David. He's the son of Abraham, the son of David, the one through whom these promises are made complete. That through you and through your offspring, all peoples will be blessed. And then this promise of a dynasty. I will be as a father to your son will be as a son to me. Okay, so that's important to get. Now, there's more going on. So, again, where were the breaks and patterns? The breaks and patterns. Well, in a patriarchal world, for the most part, there was no need to mention women in the genealogy. That the land was to be passed down, the inheritance passed down father to son, father to son, father to son. And so we'll notice that that's the pattern in this genealogy, that we get who the father is, who the son is, and then who the next son is, and the next son is. But 5 places the mom is mentioned. Okay, that's a break in the pattern. And so when the pattern breaks, we need to ask the question, okay, how come Matthew interrupted the pattern, the status quo pattern, to mention the moms, these particular women? And did you notice the women who were mentioned? And so, let's see, who's the first one that's mentioned? I think we get, is it Tamar? So let me go ahead and create some more space up here. You got this, so I'm going to erase this. So the first one that's mentioned is Tamar. And she is the wife of Judah. And then the next one that is mentioned is Rahab. And then we get Ruth. And then we have Uriah's wife. And finally we get Mary. Okay, so these are the 5 women that are mentioned in the genealogy: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Uriah's wife, and Mary. Now, if you're Jewish, you know who these women are. Okay, so again, this is another indicator that this gospel is written primarily for a Jewish audience. We have this Jewish genealogy of Jesus, and now we have these 5 women that are highlighted. And unless you're Jewish and know your Old Testament, you're not going to know who these women are. Okay, so we meet Tamar in Genesis 38. And I'd be surprised if very many of you know her story. But basically, Judah was her father-in-law. And Judah had 3 sons. And the oldest son saw Tamar and wanted to marry her. Tamar is a Canaanite woman. Okay, so she is not Jewish. She's not a good Jewish gal. She is a wild Canaanite woman, so to speak. And Judah's oldest son wants to marry her. And he persuades his father to set the marriage up. And so son number 1 of Judah marries Tamar. And we don't know what he did that was evil, but the Lord struck him down for it. He died, and he died without having any children. So the protocol in that time was that if your oldest son was married and didn't have any children, and he died before having any children, and you had a second son, then you would take the wife of your oldest son, who's now deceased, and give her to your second son, and your second son should have children with her, but they wouldn't be counted as his kids. They'd be counted as the children of his deceased older brother, so that that family line would carry on. And the inheritance would go to your older brother's children, whom you fathered, rather than to you and your own family. Okay, and that's just the way they did it, to make sure that the family lines were continued, that the oldest brother, even though he died, he would have children to go on and carry forth his name. So Judah does the right thing. He gives Tamar to son number 2. Son number 2, he's not up for this. He's fine with having sex with Tamar, but he's not going to have children with her. And so it's really pretty graphic. He withdraws from her and no children. This is evil in the eyes of the Lord. He should have been willing to not simply have sex, but to actually have children for his deceased brother. And so the Lord puts him to death. Don't know how, but he dies. So now Judah has 1 son left. And the right thing to do is to give him to Tamar, to give Tamar to him to have children for his oldest brother. Judah's thinking that Tamar is bad news. He's already lost 2 sons to her. And so he says, okay, my youngest son isn't old enough yet. You go home to your father, and when he's of age, I'll send for you and, present him to you, you to him, and you can be married and have kids for, your deceased husband. Well, Judah sends her home, but he has no intentions whatsoever of ever calling for her again and giving his youngest son to her. So what happens? Time passes. Judah's own wife dies. After a time of grieving, he's on his way to a sheep shearing festival. Tamar hears about it. She realizes that Judah has no intention of doing the right thing and giving the youngest son to her so that she has a husband. Her life is just kind of frozen, if you will. She can't remarry. She's just stuck at home under her parents' roof and with no future. So she hears that Judah is going to this sheep shearing festival, emphasis on festival, and she disguises herself as a prostitute along the side of the road to the party. And Judah sees her, inquires about her, and wants her services. And she says, okay, well, what are you going to give me? And he promises a goat to her, but he doesn't have a goat with him at the moment. So she says, okay, I'll have sex with you for a goat, but in the meantime, give me your staff and your signet ring. So he does. They have sex, and she conceives. He has no idea who he's having sex with. he goes on to the party. The next day, he wants to make good on his pledge. And so he sends a servant with the goat to where the woman was. She's not there anymore. And so he keeps his goat. He loses his staff and his signet ring. A little time passes, and he catches word that Tamar is pregnant. Again, he has no idea who the father is. And he is absolutely disgusted that she would bring shame upon the family instead of faithfully waiting for the son that she is pledged to. Instead of honoring the family by waiting and having kids with son number 3 to honor her deceased husband, son number 1, she went out and got herself pregnant. And Judah is demanding that she be put to death for such a betrayal. And so they bring her out, they're going to put her to death, and before she is stoned, put to death, she says to deliver these to Judah, that the owner of these, the staff, the signet ring, is the father of the child. Judah receives that, and he realizes that he's the father. And he confesses that she is more righteous than I. Tamar is not put to death. She gives birth to twins, and Judah becomes responsible for her, but he never has sex with her again. But that's the line of Jesus. Okay, this Canaanite woman who had to disguise herself as a prostitute and have sex with Judah, her father-in-law, in order for the family line to continue. And again, make sure you hear Judah's confession. She is more righteous than I. Okay, Rahab, maybe a little bit more familiar. We meet her in Joshua chapter 2. She is a Canaanite woman who lives in Jericho, and she is a prostitute by trade. Not just disguising herself for a one-night thing, but that's her trade. She's a prostitute, and Joshua sends spies into the land, into Jericho, to spy out. God is going to give them the city, and Rahab ends up saving the spies. And she tells them that we know that your God is God of heaven above and of earth below. We know that your God is going to give you this land. Again, she's Canaanite, she's prostitute, and she's in the line of Jesus. And she shows more faith than the Jewish spies that she took in and hid. And so they saved her life, and she becomes part of the line of Jesus. Okay, Ruth gets a whole book named after her, and Ruth is a Moabite woman. Okay, and if you know her story, that she's the one who decided to leave her people and to leave her gods and to go with her mother-in-law Naomi back to Bethlehem, and she becomes part of the Jewish people. Okay, but she's a Moabite woman. So you have an outsider who is assimilated in. And again, she was an outsider, but she was married to a Jewish man. That Jewish man died, and she ends up being loyal to her mother-in-law, her Jewish mother-in-law, and she comes back and she marries Boaz. Okay, so we have a Canaanite woman, a Canaanite prostitute, and now a Moabite woman. And you can read about where the Moabites came from in Genesis. That's a pretty gruesome story as well, but I'm not going to go into it now. But just check out the story about Lot and his daughters. Okay, so that is Ruth, the Moabite woman, Uriah's wife. Notice that she's not called by name Bathsheba. Okay, if we read in 2 Samuel, we know her name. You know, you'll find the story in 2 Samuel chapter 11, Bathsheba. But David learned that Bathsheba was Uriah's wife. Okay, but what did David do? David wanted her. And so David sent his men to get her. She was brought to the palace, and David slept with her while her husband Uriah was out on the battlefield fighting for David. And so by calling her Uriah's wife, what this does is it highlights the sin of David. That he took another man's wife, and some would argue he even raped her, power rape, because of the major difference in power between David's power and Bathsheba. that when the king's men send for you and your husband's out on the battlefield, you have really no ability to say no. And so David uses his power to take this woman. And then he tries to cover it up, and ultimately he has Uriah put on the front line so that he's killed in battle. So essentially, David takes another man's wife and then sets it up for that man to die. David kills him. He murders him. So some would argue that Uriah's wife, Bathsheba, was actually a Gentile woman. I'm not sure if I can go that far, but it highlights the sins of David in terms of committing adultery/rape and committing murder to somehow try to conceal it. And then finally we get down to Mary, and of course, Mary is pregnant with Jesus, not from Joseph, but from the Holy Spirit. And so there is scandal around her, and initially Joseph was going to try to divorce her quietly until an angel appeared to him and told him, no, take Mary as your wife. The child within her is conceived of the Holy Spirit. So these 5 women are mentioned in a genealogy of Jesus. What are they doing there? And especially around every one of them, there is scandal and shame. And at least 3 of them, Tamar, Rahab, and Ruth, at least 3 of them are Gentile. So what are they doing there in the story? Why does Matthew include them? Okay, do you remember what a genealogy does? A genealogy is designed to legitimate status. And it looks like what Matthew is doing is he is legitimating status for Gentiles within the people of the Messiah. Okay, are you with me on that? You got to get this. That in this genealogy, by mentioning these women, one of the things that Matthew is doing is he is legitimating within the family of the Messiah a place for Gentiles, because they've always been in the family of the Messiah, of the Anointed One, of the King. And so especially with the emphasis on King David, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, all Gentiles, a part of the ancestry of King David. So remember that pushback that the Jewish community, if you will, was pressing upon Jewish Christians, saying, you're wrong. How can Jesus be the Messiah if his movement is becoming Gentile and Gentiles are welcomed in and assimilated? Well, what Matthew is calling attention to is, hey, they've always been in the movement of the Messiah, of the King. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth. So that's number 1, legitimating status of Gentiles to belong to the people of the Messiah. Second thing he's doing, there is shame attached to all of these stories. There is scandal attached to all of these stories. And who is most shameful? It's not the women, it's the men. Judah's confession, she is more righteous than I. Uriah's wife. Okay, David is in the wrong. And so there's shame around the men connected with these women. And it highlights that their past are rather shameful. And so what's Matthew doing? He is saying that there is room within the people of the Messiah for folk who are very shameful of their past, who have a history of things that you would rather not talk about, things that you would rather not have to own up to, that there's room for those folk within the people of the Messiah. So it doesn't matter whether you're Gentile or not, there's room for you. And it doesn't matter how sinful you've been, how atrocious your past is, there is room for you in the family of the Messiah. So Matthew is using the genealogy to emphasize that there is a place in the family for Gentiles, and there is a place in the family for those who have a very sinful, shameful past, that there's room for you. pretty fascinating and pretty imaginative to use a genealogy to not simply legitimate the status of the king, but to use a genealogy to legitimate the status of who can be in that kingdom. Gentiles and folks with shameful, shameful past. Okay, so that's the genealogy. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about the narrative of the early chapters. So let me go ahead and race this really quick. And while I'm doing this, well, we'll do it together. So hopefully you have your Bible open, and I want you to, after we have the genealogy, I want you to take a quick look at just kind of the overall narrative journey of the first, 5 chapters. And so we have Jesus' birth. And then from the birth of Jesus, then we end up going down to Egypt. Right? So Herod is out to kill baby Jesus, and so Joseph is warned in a dream to get up and take Mary and the baby down to Egypt. So they go down to Egypt. And then the next thing we know is that they come, out of Egypt. And where do they end up? They end up at Nazareth. And then what's the next thing that happens? We get the baptism of Jesus. And then after Jesus' baptism, he begins to proclaim the kingdom of God. And the next major event is the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, hopefully you can see all that. I don't know if that's coming in super clear or not. But the birth of Jesus, and then down to Egypt, and then out of Egypt to Nazareth. And then we get the baptism of Jesus. And then we get the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, now, does this remind you of anything? Well, let's think about this for a moment. If we think Old Testament, we have the quote-unquote, the birth of the children. The birth of the children of Israel. Okay, Jacob has his 12 sons. Okay, then where do they end up? Down in Egypt. Okay, Joseph is down there. They all move down there, but they end up in slavery down in Egypt. Then what happens? Well, then, under Moses, they're brought out of Egypt. And as they are brought out of Egypt, what do they pass through? They pass through the sea. Through the Red Sea, and they're delivered. And then where does Moses lead them to? He leads them to Mount Sinai, where they receive the 10 Commandments, where they receive the Torah, the law. Okay, do you see the parallel? The birth of Jesus in Bethlehem, the birth of the children of Israel in the Promised Land, down to Egypt, out of Egypt, out of Egypt. The Israelites go through the sea. Matthew tells us about the baptism of Jesus. And then as Moses leads them to Mount Sinai and delivers the law, we have Jesus going to this mountain, and he delivers the Sermon on the Mount, which is kind of the law of the kingdom, if you will, the righteousness of the kingdom, where he makes reference to the law that Moses gave and says that I haven't come to abolish it, I've come to fulfill it. You've heard that it was said, but I say unto you. And we have the fulfillment, kind of the new Moses, if you will. So what we're seeing in this is that basically, as Matthew tells the story, Jesus is reliving Israel. Okay, I can't emphasize that enough. The message is that Jesus relives, fulfills Israel. And so we have this parallel going on in terms of Jesus' life narrative, the narrative of Israel's life, the message, Jesus relives Israel, Jesus fulfills Israel, Jesus is this promised one, to where Israel is finally getting it right, if you will, in and through Jesus. Okay, let me go ahead and erase the board, and we're going to talk about the fulfillment quotes next. Okay, so, but again, just a way to think about fulfillment. That Matthew is saying, here's the story of Jesus. He's writing for Jews who would know their story, and they would begin to make correlations like, wow, that kind of sounds like our story. In the land, down to Egypt, out of Egypt, through the sea, Mount Sinai. This is our story. Jesus is our Messiah. He's the new Moses. Okay, and so equipping Jews to kind of push back against a larger Jewish society that would tell them that they're wrong about Jesus. And they can say, no, he repeats, he relives, he fulfills our narrative. Okay, let me erase this, and then we will get on to the fulfillment quotations. Okay, so the first fulfillment quotation we're going to work with, we've already made a little reference to it, and it's found in Matthew chapter 1 and verse 22. So I'll back it up just a little bit to verse 6. Now the birth of Jesus Christ took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. And her husband Joseph, being a just man and unwilling to put her to shame, resolved to divorce her quietly. But as he considered these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not fear to take Mary as your wife, for that which is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord has spoken by the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel. Okay, again, the fulfillment quotation is verses 22 and 23. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel. Okay, well, where does this prophecy come from? This prophecy comes from Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. So the quote is from Isaiah 7:14. Now, let me give you a little bit of a backdrop here to Isaiah 7. We're about 733 years before Jesus, roughly in that time period, 735 to 730. Assyria is growing in power. And Assyria wants to take over the land of Palestine, the land of Canaan, where you have Israel and Judah and Aram, or also known as Syria. And so Assyria wants to take over this territory. Now, the kingdom is divided, so the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah. Isaiah is in Judah, where Jerusalem is at, where the temple is at. Ahaz is the king. And Ahaz is getting pretty scared right now, because Israel and Syria have formed a coalition So these two have teamed up to try to stop Assyria from coming in and taking them over. But they know that they're not strong enough by themselves to fight off Assyria. And so they are trying to force Ahaz to join with them so that they have this threefold coalition to try to stop Assyria. And Ahaz doesn't want to join them. He knows that even if he joins them, that they are not strong enough to stop Assyria. And if they fight against Assyria, he's basically going to lose his throne, if not his life. So he's afraid to join with them, doesn't want to. But he's also smaller than they are. That Israel is stronger than Judah, and then you add Syria to Israel, and it's like Ahaz and Judah, they are no match for these two kings. And so Ahaz is scared. He's shaking like a leaf in the wind. He doesn't know what to do. If he resists them, they're going to take him out. If he joins them, Assyria is going to take him out. So in his mind, it's a lose-lose. He's going to lose his throne either to the Assyrians or to Israel and Syria, if not his life. Isaiah shows up and tells him to be calm, to take courage, that he doesn't need to worry about anything, that the Lord has him, and that he's going to see if he's just calm and waits, that these two kings he doesn't need to worry about, and the Lord will be with him to deliver him. Okay, Ahaz, he doesn't have faith. And Isaiah says, okay, well, ask for a sign. The Lord wants to give you a sign. And Ahaz doesn't want a sign because if he gets a sign, then there's even more pressure to trust. And so he says, no, I don't want a sign. Well, Isaiah says, you're going to get a sign anyways. Okay, and the sign is that the virgin is going to be with child and give birth to a son. And before the boy is old enough to know right from wrong, you're going to see that God was with us and that you didn't need to worry about all this. And the name of the son is going to be Emmanuel, God with us. So this is a very kind of concrete context here in terms of Ahaz receiving a sign that speaks to him in terms of his immediate situation. Well, there's two theories on it. One is that Isaiah is talking about his own wife, that and in Hebrew it's not technically virgin as much as it's maiden, that my maiden, my bride, is going to give birth to a son, and we're going to name him Emmanuel. And before the boy's old enough to know right from wrong, you're going to see that God is with us. You should have listened. You should have trusted. But now you're going to face the pain of Assyria coming upon you. Okay, the other option is that Isaiah is actually talking about King Ahaz's wife, that your bride, your maiden, is going to give birth and to a son. And before he's old enough to know right from wrong, you're going to see that God is with us. And so some would say that it's a reference to Hezekiah. And Hezekiah was the next king in which it was kind of understood that God was with Hezekiah. So those are the two ways that it's understood in the context of Isaiah. Okay, so what I'm wanting you to realize is that when Isaiah makes this prophecy, he's not making a prediction about something that's going to happen 700 years from this crisis. Okay, he is speaking into this crisis. And to say something's going to happen 700 and some years from now, that doesn't give any comfort or hope into this situation. He is speaking directly into this crisis and saying that a son is going to be born, and by the time that son is old enough to know right from wrong, you're going to see that God is with us. Okay, now, some of you might be wondering, what did Ahaz do? Well, Ahaz contacted Assyria and paid tribute to Assyria to protect him from these two kings. And Assyria took a heavy tribute upon him. It was very costly. He lost a lot of villages, a lot of land, a lot of people, and he basically became a vassal king to Assyria. He didn't trust the Lord. Okay, but the prophecy was fulfilled. Matthew says the birth of Jesus, the Mary being pregnant with Jesus, this fulfills what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. So it's not a prediction that's coming true, but rather here you have this situation, this word into this situation, and Matthew's conviction is that Jesus fulfills that in a way that goes way beyond a prediction coming true. That God has come to us in Jesus like never before. Okay, let's look at another one real quick. So if I go a little bit further on, I come to fulfillment quotation where they are going down to Bethlehem. And let's see, where do I want to go here? Okay, so they went down to Egypt, and so now I'm at chapter 2, verse 13. So Matthew chapter 2, verse 13. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, Out of Egypt I called my son. Okay, what prophet said that? Out of Egypt I called my son? That was the prophet Hosea. And you can read that in Hosea chapter 11. Very important to get this. Hosea was not prophesying anything in terms of predicting at that point. Rather, if you look at Hosea 11, what's going on is that a charge is being laid against Israel. That God was a good father to them. That God brought them up out of Egypt and took care of them. And Israel was nothing but a rebellious son that should be put to death. And so out of Egypt I brought forth my son, or out of Egypt I called my son. Hosea is not talking about something in the future. He's talking about something in the past. And he's laying groundwork for charges against Israel for being a rebellious son. Yet Matthew says, Jesus coming out of Egypt fulfills the prophecy, Out of Egypt I brought my son. I called forth my son. Okay, one more quickly to look at. Chapter 2, still continuing on, verse 16. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious. And he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. Okay, and what Jeremiah was talking about when he made that prophecy was the exiles from Jerusalem were marched over the place where Rachel was born as they went into captivity to Babylon. And so Jeremiah is expressing the grief, the grief of this ancestress of the children of Israel as they are marched across her grave into captivity in Babylon. You could hear her weeping. And so here, Matthew is saying Jesus being brought up out of Egypt, and then the death that was taking place in Bethlehem and the grieving that was going on, Matthew is saying this fulfills the prophecy of Jeremiah, of Rachel weeping in her grave for her children. Jeremiah wasn't trying to predict the future. Jeremiah was making comment on the grief of the situation that he and his people were living through. Hosea wasn't trying to predict the future. Hosea was reminding Israel of how good God had been to them and how rebellious they were. Isaiah wasn't trying to predict the distant future. He was speaking to Ahaz about this crisis that was going on and how God would be with them through it. See, for Matthew, the fulfillment of prophecy is not so much about all these predictions in the Old Testament coming true in Jesus so that you can kind of predict or you can kind of check the prediction boxes. No, for Matthew, Jesus is the Christ, and the resurrection is what proves it. That when Jesus is crucified, no one is left believing that he really is the Christ. And Jesus confused them with his teachings about the cross, his own cross and the cross of discipleship. And Jesus was, in some sense, a riddle to them that they couldn't quite fully get. They thought they had it, he's the Christ. But then when he's crucified, He must not be. But then when he is resurrected from the dead, it's like the lights come on and they know that he is the Christ, the Messiah. And out of that conviction and that realization, they reread the Old Testament to where Jesus is the fulfillment of the whole thing. He is the fulfillment of the story of Israel. He relives Israel. He relives exile and return in terms of his own death and resurrection. And that Jesus is the one who fulfills it all. And so Matthew can take any phrase really in the Old Testament and he can find a way to say that Jesus fulfills it. Because Jesus is the fulfillment of God's purposes for Israel, the whole story. Jesus is the son of Abraham. He's the son of David. He's the promised one who fulfills the Old Testament. Okay, well, I hope that helps you kind of get a sense of promise and fulfillment, especially for Matthew, and how Matthew is equipping his Jewish readers to kind of push back against those Jews, their family members, their communities, who are saying you're wrong about Jesus. He can't be our Messiah. And Matthew's people can say, well, wait a minute here, slow down. Let's talk about this. And Matthew is bolstering their faith and equipping them to challenge others in their unbelief. All right, going to end this lecture. There's at least one more thing I want us to talk about in Matthew before we shift gears to Synoptic Gospels as a whole and then focusing in on the Gospel of Luke.